The sound of automatic gunfire echoed through the valley as Staff Sergeant Rachel Thompson adjusted her grip on Private Williams's shoulders. Behind her, 11 more wounded soldiers waited for evacuation from what had become a death trap. The enemy had them surrounded, ammunition was running low, and the nearest safe zone was 3 miles of hostile terrain away. Everyone said she was too small, too weak for frontline combat. Now 12 lives hung in the balance, and Rachel was their only hope of getting home alive. But this story begins 6 months earlier, when those same doubts nearly ended her military career before it truly started. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The gymnasium at Fort Braxton felt like a fishbowl under the harsh fluorescent lights. Captain Mitchell Davis stood at the center, his weathered hands clasped behind his back as he surveyed the assembled soldiers of Charlie Company. His gray eyes held the kind of intensity that came from 23 years of military service, including 4 combat deployments that had left their mark in the form of shrapnel scars along his left temple. "Listen up, soldiers," Davis began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned every stripe on his uniform. "We've got new orders. 6th Infantry Division is being redeployed to Syria in 8 weeks. Active combat zone. This isn't peacekeeping. This is the real deal." Rachel Thompson sat in the 3rd row, her spine straight despite the knot forming in her stomach. At 5 feet 3 inches, she was dwarfed by most of the soldiers around her, but she'd learned to project confidence even when uncertainty gnawed at her. Her auburn hair was pulled back in regulation style, and her green eyes remained fixed on Captain Davis as he continued the briefing. "I'll be conducting individual assessments over the next 2 weeks," Davis announced. "Every soldier in this company will be evaluated for combat readiness. Those who don't make the cut will be reassigned to support roles stateside." The room buzzed with murmurs and shifting bodies. Rachel felt Corporal Marcus Bennett lean over from the seat beside her. Bennett was a mountain of a man from Alabama, standing 6'4" with shoulders that seemed to span half the row. He'd become something of a protective older brother to Rachel during her 18 months at Fort Braxton. "Don't worry about it, Thompson," Bennett whispered. "You've got better marksmanship scores than half these guys." Rachel appreciated the encouragement, but she knew her shooting skills weren't what Captain Davis would be questioning. It was the same doubt that had followed her since basic training, through advanced infantry school, and into every training exercise. Could someone her size handle the physical demands of combat? Could she carry wounded soldiers to safety? Could she be trusted when lives hung in the balance? After the briefing, Rachel headed to the mess hall, her mind racing. The deployment to Syria represented everything she'd worked toward since enlisting 3 years ago. Growing up in rural Montana, she'd watched her older brother Daniel serve. 2 tours in Afghanistan before an IED ended his military career and left him with a prosthetic leg. Despite their parents' concerns, Rachel had been determined to follow in his footsteps, driven by a desire to protect others the way she'd always protected her younger siblings on their family ranch. The mess hall was crowded with soldiers discussing the deployment news. Rachel grabbed a tray of meatloaf and mashed potatoes, then looked for an empty table. Instead, she spotted Sergeant First Class Linda Rodriguez waving her over. Rodriguez was one of the few women in leadership positions within Charlie Company. A tough-as-nails veteran from Texas who had earned her stripes in Iraq. "Thompson, get over here," Rodriguez called out. "We need to talk." Rachel approached the table where Rodriguez sat with 2 other female soldiers, Specialist Amy Chun, a medic from California, and Private First Class Sarah Martinez, a communications expert from New Mexico. These women had become Rachel's informal support network, understanding the unique challenges of proving themselves in a male-dominated environment. "So," Rodriguez said without preamble, "Davis is going to try to wash you out." Rachel nearly choked on her first bite of meatloaf, What makes you say that? Chun leaned forward, lowering her voice. My boyfriend works in administration. He saw the preliminary assessment list. Davis specifically flagged you for intensive physical evaluation. That's not necessarily bad, Martinez offered, though her tone suggested she didn't believe her own words. Maybe he just wants to be thorough. Rodriguez shook her head. Davis is old school. He doesn't think women belong in combat roles, especially not small women. He's been looking for an excuse to transfer you since day one. Rachel set down her fork, her appetite gone. She'd suspected as much but had hoped her performance would speak for itself. Her PT scores were consistently above average, her tactical knowledge was solid, and her marksmanship was among the best in the company. But she knew that in Davis's mind, none of that mattered if he didn't think she could physically handle the worst-case scenarios. So what do I do? Rachel asked. You prove him wrong, Rodriguez said firmly. Whatever test he throws at you, you pass it. And if he tries to make it impossible, you find a way to make it possible anyway. That evening, Rachel made her way to the base gym. The facility was mostly empty except for a few soldiers doing late workouts. She'd always been disciplined about fitness, but now she felt the need to push herself even harder. As she loaded weights onto the squat rack, she thought about the conversation with Rodriguez and the challenge that lay ahead. The gym's heavy door swung open, and Captain Davis walked in wearing civilian workout clothes. Rachel's stomach tightened, but she continued with her routine, determined not to show any sign of intimidation. Davis headed to the bench press area, directly across from where Rachel was training. For 20 minutes, they worked out in silence, the only sounds being the clanking of weights and the hum of the ventilation system. Finally, Davis approached her as she finished a set of deadlifts. Thompson, he said, his tone neutral. Word of advice, you might want to focus on functional strength training. Combat isn't about how much you can lift in perfect conditions. Rachel met his gaze directly. What would you suggest, sir? Davis gestured toward a section of the gym equipped with sandbags, ropes, and obstacle course elements. Carry weight. Over distance. Uneven terrain. Time pressure. That's what separates soldiers who can handle combat from those who can't. It wasn't quite a challenge, but Rachel heard the implication clearly. Understood, sir. I'll incorporate that into my training. Good, Davis said, then paused. Thompson, I'm not trying to make your life difficult. But Syria isn't a training exercise. If someone goes down out there, their survival might depend on their teammates being able to get them to safety. I need to know that every soldier I deploy can handle that responsibility. After Davis left, Rachel stood alone in the gym, staring at the sandbags and rope equipment. She understood his position, even respected it to a degree. But she also knew that if she didn't prove herself in the next 2 weeks, her dreams of serving in combat would be over. She'd be transferred to some desk job, watching from the sidelines, while her fellow soldiers deployed without her. Rachel grabbed a 60-pound sandbag and hoisted it onto her shoulders. Her legs immediately protested the weight, but she began walking laps around the gym. Each step was deliberate, each breath controlled. She would show Davis and everyone else that size didn't determine strength, and that determination could overcome any physical limitation. Over the next week, Rachel threw herself into training with obsessive focus. She arrived at the gym before dawn and stayed until well after sunset. She practiced carrying increasingly heavy loads over longer distances, using every piece of functional fitness equipment available. Bennett and the other soldiers in her unit began to take notice, offering encouragement and sometimes joining her for training sessions. You're going to burn yourself out, Chun warned one evening as Rachel stumbled back to the barracks, exhausted from another marathon training session. I can't afford to burn out, Rachel replied. This is my shot. The preliminary assessment came on a rainy Thursday morning. Davis had set up a course behind the main training facility, a half-mile loop that included rope climbs, wall obstacles, and uneven terrain. Each soldier would complete the course twice, once with their standard gear, and once carrying a simulated wounded soldier. Rachel watched as soldier after soldier completed the course. Some struggled with the physical demands, others moved through it with relative ease. Bennett finished with one of the faster times, his long strides eating up the distance efficiently. When her turn came, Rachel felt every eye in the company watching her. The first run went smoothly. Rachel's smaller frame actually proved advantageous on some obstacles, allowing her to move through tight spaces and maintain balance where larger soldiers struggled. She finished with a respectable time, earning nods of approval from several of her fellow soldiers. Then came the second run, the one that would determine her fate. Davis approached her with a weighted training dummy that approximated the size and weight of an average soldier. "Thompson," he said, "this dummy weighs 180 pounds. In combat, you might need to evacuate someone even heavier. Can you handle it?" Rachel looked at the dummy, then at Davis, then at the course stretching out before her. The weight was significant, more than she'd ever carried during training. But as she stared at the challenge, she thought about her brother Daniel, about the soldiers who had carried him to safety when he was wounded, about the men and women she'd be serving alongside in Syria. "Yes, sir," she said without hesitation. "I can handle it." Davis's expression remained unreadable as he helped her position the dummy in a fireman's carry. The weight settled onto her shoulders like a crushing burden, immediately testing the limits of her strength. Around her, the company had fallen silent, everyone understanding that this moment would define her military future. Rachel took her first step toward the course, her legs shaking slightly under the load the rain had made. The ground slippery, adding another layer of difficulty to an already daunting challenge. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But as she began to move, she felt a familiar determination rising within her, the same resolve that had driven her to excel in every other aspect of her military service. This was her moment to prove that strength came in many forms, and that the will to succeed could overcome any physical limitation. The course stretched out before her like a gauntlet, and Rachel Thompson was ready to run it. The dummy hit the ground with a sickening thud as Rachel's legs finally gave out 50 yards from the finish line. Mud splattered across her uniform as she collapsed beside it, her lungs burning and vision blurring from exhaustion. The rain continued to fall, mixing with the sweat streaming down her face as she lay there, listening to the disappointed murmurs from the watching soldiers. Captain Davis approached slowly, his boots squelching in the mud. He stood over Rachel for a long moment before speaking. "Thompson, report to my office at 0800 tomorrow. We need to discuss your future with this unit." Rachel forced herself to her feet, ignoring the trembling in her legs. "Sir, I'd like to request another attempt at the assessment. That was your assessment, soldier," Davis replied curtly. "One chance is what everyone gets." As the company dispersed, Rachel remained by the fallen dummy, staring at it with a mixture of anger and determination. Corporal Bennett approached cautiously, his usual easy smile replaced by concern. "Hey, Thompson," he said gently. "You gave it everything you had. Sometimes that's not enough, and that's okay." "No," Rachel said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not okay. Those soldiers will be serving within Syria. They deserve teammates who can get them home alive. I need to be one of those teammates." That night, Rachel sat in her bunk, staring at a letter from her brother Daniel. He'd written about his physical therapy progress and his new job training other veterans with disabilities. One line kept drawing her attention: "The body can do amazing things when the mind refuses to accept limitations." Rachel made a decision. That would change everything. If Davis wouldn't give her another official assessment, she'd have to prove herself through other means. But first, she needed to understand exactly where she'd gone wrong. The next morning, Rachel arrived at Davis's office precisely at 800. The captain's workspace was spartanly decorated, a few commendations on the wall, family photos on his desk, and a map of the Middle East marked with red pins indicating his previous deployments. "Sit down, Thompson," Davis said without looking up from his paperwork. When he finally raised his eyes, his expression was not unkind, but it was firm. "I'm recommending you for transfer to the 5th 10th Support Battalion. You'll work in logistics. Coordination, important work, necessary work, but not combat. Sir, with respect, I believe I can meet the physical requirements for combat deployment." Yesterday was reality," Davis interrupted. "Thompson, you're an excellent soldier in many ways. Your tactical knowledge is impressive. Your leadership potential is clear, and your marksmanship is outstanding. But combat operations require more than those skills." Rachel leaned forward in her chair. "Captain, what if I could prove that I can handle the physical demands, not in an assessment, but in actual field conditions?" Davis studied her for a moment. "What are you proposing?" "Give me 2 weeks. Let me train with the special operations candidates who are preparing for their selection course. If I can keep up with their physical training regimen, if I can prove that I can carry wounded soldiers under real field conditions, then reconsider my combat readiness." The captain's eyebrows rose slightly. "Thompson, those candidates are preparing for some of the most physically demanding training in the military. Most of them are 6 feet tall and weigh over 200 pounds. I understand the risk, sir. But I also understand that unconventional solutions sometimes work better than conventional ones." Davis was quiet for a long moment, drumming his fingers on his desk. Finally, he spoke. "Master Sergeant Williams runs the SOC prep program. If he agrees to let you train with his candidates, and if you can complete 2 weeks of his program without dropping out, I'll arrange for you to take a modified combat assessment." Rachel felt her heart race. "Thank you, sir. I won't let you down. Don't thank me yet, Thompson." Williams's program has a 60% dropout rate among candidates who are specifically selected for their physical capabilities. What you're proposing is borderline impossible. Master Sergeant Kevin Williams was a legend at Fort Braxton. A former Green Beret with arms like tree trunks and a voice that could carry across a football field. He'd been preparing special operations candidates for over a decade. When Rachel approached him about joining his program, his reaction was exactly what she'd expected. "Are you out of your mind, soldier?" Williams boomed. "My candidates train 18 hours a day. They carry rucksacks weighing over 100 pounds through swamps and mountains. They do buddy carries for miles at a time. What makes you think you can handle that?" "Because I need to, Master Sergeant. My unit is deploying to Syria, and I refuse to be left behind because someone thinks I'm too small to do my job." Williams studied her with the kind of scrutiny usually reserved for examining weapons before a mission. "All right, Thompson. You want to play with the big boys? You show up tomorrow at 0400. Bring your gear, bring your determination, and bring a strong stomach because you're going to need all 3. The special operations candidates were an intimidating group. 8 men, all volunteers from various units across the base, all preparing for different advanced military schools. There was Jake Morrison, a towering infantryman from Ohio who was heading to Ranger School. Next to him stood Tony Russo, a compact but muscular soldier from New Jersey preparing for Special Forces selection. The group also included Derek Johnson, a soft-spoken sniper from Georgia, and Carlos Mendoza, an explosives expert from Arizona, who was known for his ability to carry impossible loads over extreme distances. When Rachel showed up for the first training session, the candidate's reaction ranged from amusement to outright skepticism. Morrison, who stood almost a foot taller than Rachel, shook his head as Williams introduced her. "Sarge, with all due respect, this isn't summer camp. We're preparing for some of the hardest military training in the world. "Morrison," Williams replied with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Thompson requested to train with you gentlemen. I figured she could use the education. Consider this a learning opportunity for all of you." The first exercise was a 12-mile ruck march through the hills surrounding Fort Braxton. Each candidate carried a 70-pound pack plus their personal gear, weapons, and water. Rachel had participated in ruck marches before, but never at this distance with this much weight. The pace Williams set was punishing. Within the first mile, Rachel felt the familiar burn in her shoulders and legs that she remembered from her failed assessment. But this time, something was different. Instead of focusing on the weight or the pain, she began studying how the other candidates managed their loads. Russo, she noticed, had developed a rhythm that seemed to conserve energy while maintaining speed. Johnson used his arms differently, keeping his core engaged to distribute weight more efficiently. Mendoza moved with an almost mechanical precision, each step calculated for maximum efficiency. By mile 6, 2 of the candidates had fallen behind. By mile 8, Rachel was keeping pace with the main group, though every muscle in her body was screaming in protest. Morrison, who had started the march with obvious disdain for her presence, began glancing back at her with something approaching respect. "How you holding up, Thompson?" he called during a brief water break. "Still here," Rachel managed between gulps of water. "Yeah," Morrison said, nodding slowly. "You are." The march concluded with a series of buddy carries. Each candidate had to carry another candidate for a quarter mile, then switch roles. When Rachel's turn came to carry Morrison, the weight differential was staggering. Morrison outweighed her by nearly 100 pounds, and picking him up required every technique she'd learned during her solo training sessions. But Rachel had spent weeks studying leverage, body mechanics, and weight distribution. She positioned Morrison carefully, adjusted her grip for optimal balance, and began moving. Her steps were smaller than the other candidates, her pace slightly slower, but she covered the required distance without dropping him. "Damn, Thompson," Morrison said when she finally set him down. "I don't know how you did that, but I'm impressed." The real breakthrough came during the third day of training. Williams had designed an exercise called casualty evacuation under fire, a simulation where candidates had to carry wounded soldiers through an obstacle course, while blank ammunition was fired over their heads and smoke grenades created chaos around them. Rachel was paired with Johnson, the sniper, who was roughly her own size, but still outweighed her by 30 pounds. The course included crawling under wire obstacles, climbing over walls, and navigating through a mock urban environment filled with debris and tight spaces. As they began the exercise, Rachel realized that her smaller size, which had been such a disadvantage in other scenarios, was actually an advantage here. She could move through tight spaces more easily, maintain better balance on narrow obstacles, and navigate the urban environment with greater agility than the larger candidates. When it was her turn to carry Johnson, she used the environment to her advantage. Instead of trying to power through obstacles with brute strength, she found ways to use walls and structures for support, maintaining momentum by choosing efficient paths rather than direct ones. Williams watched the exercise with growing interest. When it concluded, he pulled Rachel aside. "Thompson, that was smart soldiering. You're not going to outmuscle these men, but you're learning to outthink the problems they solve with strength. That's a valuable skill in special operations." The days that followed became a blur of exhausting training exercises. There were night navigation courses where candidates had to carry equipment through complete darkness. There were water survival exercises where they practiced rescue techniques in full gear. There were combat simulations that combined physical demands with tactical decision-making under extreme stress. Rachel failed some exercises completely. During a climbing exercise that required upper body strength she simply didn't possess, she couldn't complete the course. But she also succeeded in unexpected ways. During a tracking exercise that required candidates to move silently through dense forest while carrying heavy packs, her smaller footprint and natural grace gave her a significant advantage. More importantly, she began earning the respect of her fellow candidates. Russo started sharing tips about load distribution and energy conservation. Mendoza showed her breathing techniques that helped manage fatigue during long carries. Johnson taught her how to use terrain features to make movement more efficient. By the end of the first week, Rachel had completed every major exercise, though not always within the time limits set for the male candidates. Williams began modifying some requirements specifically for her, focusing on technique and determination rather than raw physical performance. "The thing about special operations," Williams explained during one of their evening debriefings, "isn't that everyone has to be exactly the same. It's that everyone has to be excellent at something and good enough at everything else. You're finding your excellence, Thompson." As the second week began, Rachel felt a transformation occurring. Her body had adapted to the extreme demands. Her technique had improved dramatically, and her confidence had grown exponentially. But more than that, she'd proven something to herself and to the candidates training alongside her. She belonged here. Not because she was as strong as the men around her, but because she brought unique capabilities and unshakable determination to every challenge. When the final exercise of the program arrived, a comprehensive test that combined everything they'd learned over 2 weeks, Rachel was ready to prove that excellence came in many forms. The final exercise began at midnight. Williams had constructed what he called the Gauntlet, a 5-mile course that wound through the darkest, most challenging terrain on Fort Braxton. It combined everything the candidates had learned: land navigation, casualty evacuation, tactical movement, and endurance under extreme conditions. Rachel stood with the 7 remaining SOC candidates at the starting point, her gear checked and rechecked. Over the past 2 weeks, she'd earned her place among these elite soldiers through sheer determination and adaptive thinking. Tonight would determine whether that acceptance translated into actual capability. "Listen up," Williams announced, his voice cutting through the humid night air. "This exercise simulates a real-world scenario. Your unit has been ambushed deep in enemy territory. You have wounded soldiers, limited ammunition, and hostile forces tracking your movement. Your mission is to reach the extraction point while ensuring no one gets left behind." He gestured toward 8 weighted dummies positioned near the starting line, each representing a wounded soldier. Each candidate is responsible for evacuating 1 casualty. You'll encounter multiple obstacles, navigate through unmarked terrain, and complete tactical objectives along the way. Mission failure means starting over. Individual failure means you're out of the program. Rachel looked at her assigned dummy, a 165-pound training aide that she'd nicknamed Carter during practice sessions. She'd carried Carter dozens of times over the past week, learning every nuance of weight distribution and movement technique. But those had been short-distance exercises. Tonight's 5-mile journey would test the limits of everything she'd learned. Morrison approached her as they prepared to begin. "Thompson, want to trade dummies? Mine's only 150 pounds. Rachel shook her head. "Thanks, but I've been training with Carter here. We understand each other," Morrison grinned. "Carter? Every good soldier deserves a name," Rachel replied, adjusting her grip on the dummy. "Besides, in a real situation, I won't get to choose who needs help." Williams raised his hand. "Candidates, you have 4 hours to reach the extraction point. Clock starts now." The first mile took them through dense forest, navigating by compass and terrain features alone. Rachel had developed her own rhythm for carrying Carter, a steady, ground-eating pace that conserved energy while maintaining forward momentum. She used her smaller size to move efficiently through thick underbrush where the larger candidates had to force their way through. Johnson, the sniper, stayed close to Rachel during this section, having learned to appreciate her natural stealth capabilities. "You move like a ghost through this stuff," he whispered during a brief halt. "Ranch life," Rachel replied quietly. "Spent my childhood tracking cattle through the Montana wilderness. Different trees, same principles." The first major obstacle appeared at mile marker 2, a 50-foot ravine with a fast-moving stream at the bottom. A single rope stretched across the gap, anchored to trees on either side. The candidates would have to transport their casualties across using the rope bridge while maintaining tactical silence. Russo went first, his upper body strength allowing him to traverse the rope quickly while carrying his dummy. Mendoza followed, using a technique that distributed weight more evenly, but took longer to complete. When Rachel's turn came, she faced a unique challenge. Her lighter body weight made the rope bridge more unstable, causing it to sway with each movement. Instead of fighting the sway, Rachel used it to her advantage. She timed her movements to work with the rope's natural oscillation, creating a rhythm that actually made the crossing smoother. When she reached the other side, Williams nodded approvingly. "Adaptive problem solving," he noted quietly to his assistant. "She's not just keeping up, she's finding better solutions." Mile 3 introduced urban warfare simulation. The candidates entered a mock town constructed from shipping containers and plywood structures. Here, they had to move tactically through enemy territory, while avoiding detection and reaching specific waypoints. Motion sensors throughout the area would trigger alarms if the candidates moved carelessly. This environment perfectly suited Rachel's developing skill set. Her smaller profile made her harder to detect, and her ranch background had taught her to move quietly across any terrain. She led her group through the urban maze, identifying safe routes and timing movements to avoid the sensor network. "Thompson, take point," Morrison whispered as they approached a particularly challenging section. It was a significant moment. The largest, strongest candidate in the group was deferring to Rachel's tactical expertise. Rachel accepted the responsibility without hesitation. She scouted ahead, identified patrol patterns in the sensor network, and guided the entire group through a complex route that avoided detection while maintaining their timeline. When they emerged from the urban area, all 8 candidates were still together and on schedule. The 4th mile brought them to the exercise's most demanding physical challenge, a mountain slope so steep it required rope-assisted climbing while carrying the casualties. The candidates would have to ascend 500 vertical feet of rocky terrain, much of it requiring technical climbing skills. This was where Rachel's weeks of studying body mechanics and leverage paid off dramatically. While the other candidates relied primarily on arm and back strength to haul their dummies up the slope, Rachel had developed a system using her legs and core to drive movement while using the rope for balance rather than support. She established anchor points as she climbed, creating a pulley system that allowed her to lift Carter in stages rather than attempting to carry the full weight continuously. It was slower than the brute force approach used by some candidates, but it was also more sustainable over the long distance. Halfway up the slope, disaster struck. Johnson lost his grip on his dummy, and it tumbled 30 feet down the rocky face. The sniper was devastated. Dropping his casualty meant exercise failure and elimination from the program. "Leave it," Russo called out. "We can't risk the whole group for one mistake." Rachel looked down at Johnson, who was staring at his fallen dummy with despair. She thought about her brother Daniel, about the soldiers who had risked everything to bring him home, about the principle that no one gets left behind. "Negative," Rachel called out. "We're not leaving anyone." She secured Carter at her current position and began rappelling down toward Johnson's dummy. The descent was treacherous, requiring her to navigate loose rocks and uncertain anchor points. When she reached the fallen casualty, she realized the true scope of the challenge. She now had to get 2 dummies up a slope. That had been difficult enough with one. Rachel's solution was elegant in its simplicity. She used her climbing rope to create a mechanical advantage system, linking both dummies together and using the slope's natural features as anchor points. It took longer than anyone expected, but she successfully hauled both casualties to the top of the slope where the other candidates waited. Johnson was speechless. "Thompson, I don't know what to say. You just saved my career." "That's what teammates do," Rachel replied, exhausted but determined to continue. The final mile tested everything they'd learned about endurance and willpower. The terrain was flat but covered in loose sand that made every step require extra effort. By this point, all the candidates were operating on pure determination. Their bodies pushed beyond normal limits. Rachel found herself in an unexpected position, leading the group's pace. Her efficient movement techniques and superior conditioning from 2 weeks of intensive training had given her an advantage as fatigue set in for the larger candidates. Morrison, who had started the exercise as the group's natural leader, was now following Rachel's lead. "How is she still moving so fast?" Mendoza gasped during a brief water break. "She's not just carrying weight," Williams observed from his position monitoring the exercise. "She's managing energy like a long-distance runner. The others are sprinting. A marathon." With half a mile to go, Rachel made a decision that would be talked about in SOC training for years afterward. She noticed that Russo was struggling badly, his legs barely supporting his own weight, let alone his casualties. Without being asked, Rachel repositioned herself to support part of Russo's load while continuing to carry Carter. "Thompson, you can't carry 2 casualties," Russo protested weakly. "I'm not carrying 2 casualties," Rachel replied through gritted teeth. "I'm helping a teammate complete the mission." The extraction point came into view as dawn broke over Fort Braxton. All 8 candidates crossed the finish line together, with all 8 casualties accounted for. They had completed Williams's impossible exercise as a unit, and Rachel had played a crucial role in ensuring no one was left behind. Williams approached the exhausted group with something approaching amazement on his face. "Candidates, in 10 years of running this program, I have never seen a group complete the gauntlet with a perfect score. You didn't just succeed, you exceeded every expectation." He turned specifically to Rachel. "Thompson, you didn't just keep up with these soldiers. You led them. You innovated solutions they couldn't see, and you demonstrated the kind of leadership that defines special operations." As the candidates began the long walk back to base, Morrison fell into step beside Rachel. "You know what the crazy part is? I came into this program thinking I was going to prove I belonged with the elite. Turns out I needed to learn from someone who was already there." Rachel was too exhausted to respond eloquently, but she managed a tired smile. "We all proved we belong here." Captain Davis was waiting at the base gym when they returned. His expression was unreadable as Williams briefed him on the exercise results, but Rachel caught him nodding several times during the conversation. When Williams finished his report, Davis approached Rachel directly. "Thompson, I owe you an apology. I questioned your physical capability because I couldn't see past conventional measurements of strength. What you demonstrated last night was something more valuable than raw power, adaptive leadership under extreme conditions." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I'm not just approving your deployment to Syria. I'm recommending you for advanced tactical leadership training. The Army needs soldiers who can think beyond standard solutions." Rachel felt a surge of vindication, but also something else, the understanding that this was just the beginning. The gauntlet had proven she could excel in controlled conditions with motivated teammates. Syria would present challenges that no training exercise could fully simulate. As news of her performance spread through Fort Braxton, Rachel found herself in an unfamiliar position, being celebrated rather than doubted. But she also knew that the real test still lay ahead, in a combat zone where the stakes would be measured in lives rather than training scores. The transport plane's engines roared as Charlie Company descended toward Al-Hasaka Air Base in northeastern Syria. Rachel pressed her face to the small window, watching the desert landscape unfold below. Endless stretches of sand, broken by ancient riverbeds and scattered settlements that looked like toys from 30,000 feet. After months of preparation, the reality of deployment was finally hitting her. "First time in country?" asked Staff Sergeant Michelle Palmer, the company's new intelligence analyst who had joined them just before deployment. Palmer was a sharp-eyed veteran from Colorado with 3 previous Middle East deployments under her belt. "First combat deployment," Rachel confirmed, adjusting her gear as the plane began its descent. "You? 4th tour, but first time in Syria. Iraq and Afghanistan were different animals. This place has its own rules." The base at Al-Hasaka was a sprawling complex of prefabricated buildings, concrete barriers, and constant activity. Helicopters lifted off and landed with mechanical precision while convoys of armored vehicles moved through heavily guarded checkpoints. The air shimmered with heat waves and dust seemed to coat everything within minutes of exposure. Captain Davis gathered Charlie Company for their initial briefing in a sweltering conference room that smelled of diesel fuel and disinfectant. A large map of northern Syria covered one wall, marked with red zones indicating hostile territory and green zones showing areas under coalition control. "Welcome to the edge of the world," Davis began, his tone more serious than Rachel had ever heard it. "Our area of operations covers 60 square miles of contested territory. Kurdish forces control the major towns, but ISIS remnants and other hostile groups move freely through the rural areas." He pointed to several locations on the map. "Our primary mission is force protection and convoy security for humanitarian supply routes. Secondary mission is intelligence gathering and supporting Kurdish allies in maintaining territorial control." Rachel studied the map intently. The terrain was vastly different from anything she'd trained on. Open desert interspersed with rocky hills, ancient ruins, and modern settlements connected by roads that looked more like suggestions than actual infrastructure. "Thompson," Davis continued, "you'll be assigned to Alpha Squad as assistant team leader. Your job is convoy security and casualty evacuation support. The training you completed has prepared you for exactly these kinds of operations." Alpha Squad consisted of 6 soldiers under the command of Sergeant First Class David Kim, a calm and methodical leader from Seattle who had earned his stripes in Afghanistan. The squad included Morrison, who had requested transfer to Rachel's unit after their SOS training together, along with 4 other experienced soldiers: Corporal Lisa Wong, a communications specialist from Hawaii; Private First Class Michael Torres, a medic from Texas; Specialist Brandon Clark, a heavy weapons expert from Michigan; and Private Nathan Brooks, a young engineer from Pennsylvania who specialized in detecting and disarming explosive devices. "Our first mission is tomorrow," Kim explained during Alpha Squad's initial team meeting. "Humanitarian convoy to the village of Tel Afar, about 30 miles northeast of here. Intel suggests the route is clear, but in this EO, Intel is often optimistic." Rachel spent her first evening at Al-Hasaka studying maps and intelligence reports, trying to understand the complex political and military landscape they'd be operating in. The region was a patchwork of competing factions: Kurdish forces, Syrian government troops, Turkish-backed militias, and various insurgent groups that shifted allegiances based on opportunity rather than ideology. Juan joined her in the cramped study area, spreading out detailed route maps for the next day's mission. "First convoy is always nerve-wracking," Wang said, "but this route is considered relatively safe. Good introduction to how operations work here. What should I expect?" Rachel asked. "Lots of dust, terrible roads, and checkpoint protocols that change daily," Wang replied. "The villages are where it gets interesting. You never know if you're walking into a warm welcome or a potential ambush." People here have learned to be very careful about showing support for coalition forces. The convoy departed Al-Hasaka at dawn, consisting of 4 armored vehicles carrying medical supplies, water purification equipment, and educational materials for the village school. Rachel rode in the second vehicle with Kim and Morrison, her role to provide security and assist with any medical emergencies that might arise. The Syrian landscape was hauntingly beautiful in the early morning light. Ancient Tell mounds, archaeological sites thousands of years old, dotted the horizon like sleeping giants. Shepherds moved their flocks across terrain that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, seemingly oblivious to the modern military. Vehicles passing by. Hard to believe this place has been continuously inhabited for over 5,000 years, Morrison observed, studying the landscape through his weapon scope. Makes our problems seem pretty temporary, Rachel replied, but she remained focused on her sector of responsibility, scanning for signs of danger. The first indication that this mission would be more complicated than expected came 20 miles from Al-Hasaka. Brooks, monitoring his explosive detection equipment, called out a warning, possible IED signature ahead. Strong metallic reading buried in the roadway. The convoy halted while Brooks and his team investigated. Rachel watched him work, admiring the methodical precision with which he approached the potential threat. Using a combination of electronic sensors and careful visual inspection, Brooks determined that the metallic signature was debris from a vehicle destroyed months earlier, not an active explosive device. False alarm, Brooks reported. Roads clear to proceed. But the incident served as a reminder that in Syria, danger could materialize without warning. Rachel found herself studying the terrain with new intensity, looking for signs of disturbance that might indicate hidden threats. Tel Afar appeared on the horizon as a cluster of ancient stone buildings surrounded by modern concrete structures. The village had existed in various forms for over a millennium, its strategic location making it valuable to successive rulers throughout history. Now it housed about 3,000 people who survived through a combination of subsistence farming and careful neutrality in the ongoing conflicts. The villagers' reaction to the convoy was cautiously positive. Children peered around corners and from rooftops, their curiosity barely overcoming their wariness. Adults emerged slowly, keeping their hands visible and their movements deliberate to avoid any misunderstandings. Rachel's first real interaction with Syrian civilians came when Torres, the medic, was called to examine an elderly man suffering from what appeared to be a severe respiratory infection. The man's family had gathered around him in obvious distress, speaking rapidly in Arabic to their village elder who served as translator. "Can you help me with this?" Torres asked Rachel. "I need someone to help position him while I examine his lungs." Rachel approached the elderly patient carefully, aware that her presence as a female soldier might be culturally sensitive. But the man's condition was clearly serious, and his family's concern transcended any social hesitations. She helped Torres position the patient for examination while Kim coordinated with the village elder to arrange for medical evacuation to a Kurdish field hospital. "Thank you," the elder said to Rachel in careful English. "You are very gentle with him. This is good." The medical evacuation required careful coordination with Kurdish forces, who controlled the nearest hospital facility. Rachel found herself serving as liaison between Torres, who was managing the patient's immediate care, and Kim, who was coordinating transportation and security protocols. "Thompson, I need you to ride with the patient," Kim decided. "Torres will drive the medical vehicle, and I need someone with combat training to provide security during transport." The journey to the Kurdish field hospital took them through territory that was technically secure, but practically unpredictable. Rachel rode in the back of the medical vehicle with the elderly patient, monitoring his condition while staying alert for potential threats. The man's breathing was labored, but he remained conscious and seemed to draw comfort from her presence at one point during the transport. The patient reached out and grasped Rachel's hand, speaking quietly in Arabic. Although she couldn't understand his words, his tone conveyed gratitude and trust. It was a profound moment that drove home the human impact of their mission. The Kurdish hospital was a remarkable facility, modern medical equipment housed in repurposed buildings, staffed by doctors and nurses who had maintained professional standards despite years of conflict. Rachel helped transfer the patient to the Kurdish medical team, ensuring that all relevant information about his condition was properly communicated. Dr. Layla Hassan, the attending physician, was a woman about Rachel's age who had completed her medical training in Damascus before the war disrupted normal life. She spoke excellent English and seemed impressed by the quality of care Torres had provided during transport. "Your medic did excellent work stabilizing him," Dr. Hassan told Rachel. "He will recover, thanks to your quick response." "Will his family be able to visit him here?" Rachel asked. "Yes, we have protocols for civilian visitors. This man's condition was serious. Without your intervention, he might not have survived." The return journey to Tel Afar gave Rachel time to reflect on her first real mission. She had successfully transitioned from training scenarios to actual field operations, adapting to unexpected medical emergencies and navigating complex cultural interactions. But more importantly, she had contributed to saving a life, exactly the kind of mission that had drawn her to military service. Back in Tel Afar, the successful medical evacuation had clearly improved the villagers' perception of the coalition forces. Children who had previously hidden now approached the soldiers with shy curiosity. Adults engaged in more open conversation with the village elder, asking questions about the medical supplies and educational materials the convoy had brought. Kim gathered Alpha Squad for a debriefing before their return to Al-Hasaka. "Good work today, everyone. Thompson, your handling of the medical situation was exactly what I needed from an assistant team leader. You kept things calm, coordinated between multiple parties, and adapted to changing circumstances." Morrison grinned. "Plus you made that old man feel safe during transport. That's the kind of thing that builds trust with local populations." As the convoy prepared to depart Tel Afar, Rachel felt a sense of accomplishment that went beyond personal validation. She had proven that her training translated effectively to real-world operations, but more importantly, she had helped save a life and contributed to the broader mission of building stability in a war-torn region. The return journey to Al-Hasaka was uneventful, giving Rachel time to process her first taste of combat operations. Syria was proving to be exactly as complex and unpredictable as Palmer had warned, but it was also revealing opportunities to make a genuine difference in people's lives. That evening, as Alpha Squad completed their after-action reports, Kim pulled Rachel aside for a private conversation. "Thompson, I've been watching how you handle yourself in the field. You've got natural instincts for this kind of work, staying calm under pressure, reading situations quickly, adapting to unexpected circumstances." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I'm putting you in for specialized training as a combat lifesaver instructor. The Army needs soldiers who can teach others how to save lives under fire. Based on what I saw today, you've got the right combination of technical skills and leadership presence." Rachel felt a familiar surge of pride, but also the weight of increased responsibility. Syria was teaching her that her unique strengths had real value in combat operations, but it was also showing her that the stakes would only get higher as their deployment continued. 3 weeks into their Syrian deployment, Alpha Squad received their most challenging assignment yet. Intelligence reports indicated that a Kurdish militia unit had gone missing near the village of Kumsli, close to the Turkish border. Their last radio transmission mentioned wounded soldiers and requested immediate medical evacuation, but then all communication ceased. Captain Davis, briefed the rescue mission in the pre-dawn darkness of the operations center. The walls were covered with satellite imagery showing the rugged border region, a maze of rocky hills, abandoned villages, and unmarked minefields left over from decades of conflict. "The missing unit is Bravo Company, 3rd Kurdish Regiment," Davis explained, pointing to their last known position on the tactical map. 12 soldiers led by Commander Azad Halil, one of our most reliable Kurdish allies. They were conducting a reconnaissance patrol when they encountered what appeared to be a well-organized insurgent force. Rachel studied the terrain imagery with growing concern. The area around Kamishli was notorious for its difficult terrain and complex cave systems that had hidden fighters for generations. If Kurdish soldiers, who knew this landscape intimately, had gotten into trouble there, any rescue mission would face extreme challenges. "Sir, what's the threat assessment?" asked Sergeant Kim. "Unknown insurgent force, estimated strength of 20 to 30 fighters. They're well-armed, disciplined, and familiar with the local terrain. Intelligence suggests they may be using the old smuggling tunnels that run along the Turkish border." Davis continued the briefing with tactical details that made the mission's complexity clear. The Kurdish unit's last position was in a valley surrounded by high ridges, accessible only through narrow mountain passes that could easily become kill zones. Air support would be limited due to the proximity to Turkish airspace, and the rough terrain made vehicle-based evacuation nearly impossible. "This is a footmobile operation," Davis concluded. "Light and fast with emphasis on medical support and extraction capability. Alpha Squad will lead the mission, supported by 2 Kurdish guides who know the area." After the briefing, Kim gathered his team for detailed planning. The mission would require each soldier to carry maximum medical supplies while maintaining full combat readiness, a challenging balance that would test their physical conditioning and tactical flexibility. "Thompson," Kim said, "I'm designating you as primary casualty evacuation coordinator. If we find wounded Kurdish soldiers, you'll be responsible for organizing their transport out of the area." Rachel felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. The Kurdish soldiers were allies who had risked their lives supporting coalition operations. If they were wounded and trapped, every minute of delay could mean the difference between life and death. The mission team departed Al-Hasaka before sunrise, traveling in specially modified vehicles designed for the rough border terrain. In addition to Alpha Squad, the team included 2 Kurdish guides, Sergeant Major Rahava, a weathered veteran who had fought in these mountains for over a decade, and Corporal Dilovan, a young intelligence specialist who spoke fluent Arabic and Turkish in addition to Kurdish and English. "The area we're entering has been contested for many years," Rahava explained during the vehicle journey. "Many caves, many hiding places. Insurgents know we are coming before we know they are there. The vehicles could only take them within 5 miles of the target area. From there, the team would have to move on foot through terrain that Ruyova described as unforgiving to those who don't understand its ways." Rachel had packed her gear with meticulous care: advanced medical supplies, communications equipment, extra water, and ammunition. But she'd also brought something unusual: a lightweight pulley system that could be used for technical rescue operations. Her experience with the SOS candidates had taught her that unconventional tools often provided solutions that brute force couldn't achieve. The foot movement began in pre-dawn darkness, with Rahava leading the team through narrow goat trails that wound between massive boulders and ancient terraces carved into the hillsides. The pace was steady but cautious. This terrain offered countless opportunities for ambush, and the team couldn't afford to stumble into a trap while attempting a rescue. 2 hours into the movement, they encountered the first sign of trouble. Dilovan, who was monitoring radio frequencies, detected fragmented communications in Arabic that suggested insurgent forces were actively coordinating in the area. "They know something is happening," Dilovan reported quietly. multiple groups, talking about movement from the south and preparing positions. Kim made the tactical decision to continue the mission despite the increased threat. The Kurdish soldiers were allies who had taken significant risks to support coalition operations. Abandoning them wasn't an option. Regardless of the danger, the terrain became increasingly challenging as they approached the target area. Narrow ridges dropped away into deep valleys on either side, forcing the team to move in single file along paths that were barely wide enough for one person. Rachel found herself using techniques she'd learned during SOS training, but adapted. For the unique challenges of Syrian mountain terrain, at 0800 hours, they reached an observation point overlooking the valley where the Kurdish unit had last been seen. What they discovered was worse than anyone had anticipated. Through binoculars, Rachel could see the Kurdish soldiers' position, a small cluster of rocks and abandoned buildings at the valley floor, completely surrounded by insurgent forces occupying the high ground. Count 12 Kurdish soldiers, Morrison reported, scanning the area through his rifle scope. Several appear to be wounded and unable to move. Insurgent positions on 3 ridges, estimated 30 fighters with machine guns and RPGs. Kim studied the tactical situation with growing alarm. The Kurdish soldiers were trapped in what military tacticians call a kill box, a position where enemy forces could direct overlapping fields of fire from multiple directions. Any rescue attempt would have to neutralize or bypass the insurgent positions while evacuating wounded soldiers across difficult terrain. This is going to require coordination with air support, Kim decided. We can't extract casualties under fire without close air support to suppress the insurgent positions. But when Kim called for air support, the response was devastating. Negative. On close air support, came the reply from base operations. Turkish military has declared the area off-limits due to border security concerns. You're on your own. Rachel felt her stomach drop as the full implications of their situation became clear. 12 Kurdish soldiers were trapped and wounded, surrounded by a larger insurgent force that controlled the tactical advantage of high ground. Alpha Squad would have to attempt a rescue without air support, vehicle support, or reinforcements. Sir, Rachel said to Kim, I have an idea, but it's going to require trusting me to do something that looks impossible. Kim looked at her with the expression of a commander who was running out of conventional options. I'm listening. Rachel pointed to a narrow ravine that ran along the eastern side of the valley. That ravine connects to the Kurdish position, but it's too narrow and steep for the insurgents to cover effectively with their heavy weapons. If I can get down there with medical supplies, I might be able to reach the wounded soldiers and start organizing evacuation. Thompson, that ravine is a death trap, Morrison protested. If they spot you, you'll have nowhere to run. But they won't be looking for someone small enough to move through terrain they consider impassable, Rachel replied. My size has been a disadvantage in every training scenario we've done. Maybe here it's an advantage. Rehava, who had been studying the terrain through his binoculars, spoke up. The American soldier is correct. That ravine is very difficult, but it provides concealment. Insurgents will not expect an attack from that direction. Kim wrestled with the decision for several long minutes. Sending Rachel into the ravine alone was an enormous risk, but conventional assault tactics against the insurgent positions would likely result in casualties on both sides and might not succeed in rescuing the trapped Kurdish soldiers. All right, Thompson, Kim finally decided. But you don't go alone. Morrison and Torres will provide overwatch from the ridge. Rehava will guide you through the ravine approach. If this goes wrong, we will extract you immediately. Rachel checked her gear one final time, focusing on medical supplies and communication equipment rather than heavy weapons. Her mission wasn't to fight the insurgents. It was to reach the wounded Kurdish soldiers and coordinate their evacuation. The descent into the ravine was treacherous. The walls were nearly vertical in places, requiring technical climbing skills that Rachel had developed during SOC training. But her smaller size allowed her to navigate through spaces that would have been impossible for larger soldiers. Rahava moved with the fluid grace of someone who had spent his entire life in these mountains. He guided Rachel through the most difficult sections, showing her handholds and footholds that weren't obvious to someone unfamiliar with the terrain. "Kurdish soldiers are very brave," Rahava whispered as they worked their way down the ravine. "They will fight until there is no ammunition left. We must reach them soon." As they descended deeper into the ravine, Rachel could hear the sound of sporadic gunfire echoing off the valley walls. The Kurdish soldiers were still alive and fighting, but their situation was clearly desperate. Every minute that passed reduced their chances of survival. The bottom of the ravine was a maze of fallen rocks and thorny vegetation that provided excellent concealment but made movement slow and difficult. Rachel had to crawl through spaces barely wide enough for her body, dragging her medical supplies behind her. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes, they reached a position where Rachel could see the Kurdish soldiers' defensive position. What she saw filled her with both hope and dread. The Kurdish soldiers were alive, but several were clearly wounded, and their ammunition was running low. "I can see them," Rachel whispered into her radio. "Multiple wounded, still fighting, but they won't last much longer." Kin's voice crackled back through static. "Roger, what's your assessment for evacuation?" Rachel studied the situation carefully. The wounded Kurdish soldiers would need to be carried out individually, and the only viable route was back through the ravine she'd just navigated. It would require multiple trips under fire, with no guarantee that the insurgents wouldn't discover their escape route. "It's possible," Rachel reported, "but it's going to be the hardest thing any of us have ever done." Rachel's plan was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its execution. She would infiltrate the Kurdish position through the ravine, stabilize the wounded soldiers for transport, and then evacuate them one by one back through the narrow passage while Alpha Squad provided diversionary fire to keep the insurgents occupied. "Thompson, this is insane," Morrison's voice crackled through her earpiece. "You're talking about making 12 trips through that ravine while carrying wounded soldiers." 11 trips, Rachel corrected. One of them might be able to walk with assistance. The first phase required reaching the Kurdish position without alerting the insurgents. Rachel and Rahava worked their way along the ravine floor, using every piece of cover available. The sound of gunfire above them was constant now. The Kurdish soldiers were running critically low on ammunition and fighting for their lives. When they reached the edge of the Kurdish defensive position, Rachel could see the full scope of the challenge. Commander Halil, the Kurdish unit leader, was conscious but had taken shrapnel to his leg. 3 soldiers were unconscious from blood loss. 2 had broken bones from explosive impacts, and the rest were wounded but still fighting. "American soldier?" Halil asked in accented English when Rachel appeared at the edge of their position. His expression mixed surprise with desperate hope. "Staff Sergeant Rachel Thompson, U.S. Army," Rachel replied, already moving toward the most critically wounded soldier. "We're here to get you out." "Impossible," Halil said. "Too many insurgents. They have machine guns on all the ridges." Rachel was already working on the unconscious soldier, checking vital signs and applying pressure bandages to control bleeding. "Nothing's impossible. It's just difficult." Torres had taught her advanced combat medical techniques during their deployment, and she put every lesson to use. The unconscious soldier, a young Kurdish fighter named Baran, had lost significant blood from a shrapnel wound to his abdomen. Rachel started an IV line and applied a pressure dressing, stabilizing him enough for transport. "Rahava, help me get him positioned for carry," Rachel instructed. The Kurdish guide looked skeptical but followed her directions, helping to secure Baran in a modified fireman's carry that would allow Rachel to navigate the narrow ravine, the first evacuation. Trip was a nightmare of careful movement through impossibly tight spaces. Baran was unconscious, which made him dead weight, and the ravine required technical climbing in several sections. But Rachel's months of training with weighted dummies and her experience with the SOS candidates had prepared her for exactly this challenge. Halfway through the ravine, disaster nearly struck. A section of loose rock gave way under the combined weight, and Rachel found herself dangling by one hand while supporting Baran with the other. For a terrifying moment, she thought they would both fall to their deaths. "Easy, easy," Rahava whispered from above, extending a rope to help stabilize them. "Use the rope, but move slowly." Rachel managed to secure the rope around both herself and Baran, then worked her way hand over hand to safer ground. When they finally reached the extraction point where Kim waited with a medical team, Baran was still alive and his vital signs were stable. "One down, 11 to go," Rachel reported, already preparing for the return trip. "Thompson, you can't do this 11 more times," Kim protested. "You're already exhausted, and the insurgents are getting more aggressive." Rachel looked back toward the ravine, where she could hear the sounds of intensifying combat. "Those soldiers trusted us to bring them home. I'm not stopping until all 12 are safe." The second evacuation was easier. A Kurdish soldier named Dildar, who had a broken arm, but could assist with his own movement. They made good time through the ravine, with Dildar using his uninjured arm to help navigate the climbing sections. Third soldier, however, presented a new challenge. Sergeant Hawar had taken a bullet through his shoulder and was drifting in and out of consciousness from shock and blood loss. He was also significantly larger than the previous casualties, outweighing Rachel by nearly 80 pounds. "This one will be very difficult," Rahava warned. "He is heavy and the climb sections will be dangerous." Rachel studied Hawar's condition and made a tactical decision. Instead of attempting a traditional fireman's carry, she rigged and improvised harness system using climbing rope and her tactical vest. The system distributed Hawar's weight more evenly and allowed her to use mechanical advantage during the climbing sections. The technique worked, but it was brutally exhausting. By the time she delivered Hawar to the extraction point, Rachel was operating on pure willpower. Her shoulders screamed in protest, her legs shook with fatigue, and her hands were raw from rope burns. "That's 3, she reported to Kim. 9 more to go." As the evacuations continued, the insurgents began to realize something was happening. They increased their rate of fire and started probing the Kurdish position more aggressively. Alpha Squad responded with precision counterfire. But ammunition was becoming a concern for everyone involved. The fourth and fifth evacuations went smoothly. Both soldiers were conscious and able to assist with their own movement. But the sixth evacuation nearly ended in disaster when insurgent fire began impacting near the ravine entrance. Rachel was carrying Corporal Zagros, who had severe burns from an explosive device, when bullets began striking the rocks around them. She pressed herself against the ravine wall, shielding Zagros with her own body while calling for suppressive fire. "Morrison, I need a cover fire on the eastern ridge," she called into her radio. "They spotted our route." Morrison's rifle cracked repeatedly as he engaged insurgent positions, buying Rachel the time she needed to reach safety. When she finally delivered Zagros to the medical team, Kim made a command decision. "Thompson, this is too dangerous. We need to find another way." "There is no other way," Rachel replied firmly. 6 soldiers are still trapped up there, and they're counting on us. The 7th evacuation was Commander Halil himself. Despite his leg wound, he insisted on helping with the movement, using his knowledge of the terrain to guide them through the most difficult sections. His presence made the journey faster and safer, but Rachel could see that his condition was deteriorating. "You are a very brave soldier," Halil told her as they navigated a particularly challenging climb. Kurdish people will not forget this. By the 8th evacuation, Rachel was operating on instinct and determination alone. Her body had moved beyond normal fatigue into a zone where only willpower kept her functioning. The soldier she was carrying, a young fighter named Baravan, who had taken shrapnel to both legs, sensed Rachel's exhaustion and tried to help by adjusting her position to make the carry easier. "American sister," Baravan whispered in broken English, "you are very strong." The 9th and 10th evacuations blurred together in Rachel's memory. She moved through the ravine like a machine, focusing only on the next handhold, the next step, the next breath. Her teammates watched in amazement as she continued to function despite physical demands that should have been impossible. When Rachel began the 11th evacuation, she was carrying Private Sherwan, who had been unconscious since the beginning of the firefight. As she worked her way through the ravine, she could hear the sounds of combat intensifying above them. The Kurdish position was almost overrun, and the last soldier, a fighter named Jian, was holding the entire defensive line by himself. "Almost there," Rachel whispered to the unconscious Sherwan as they navigated the final climbing section. "Almost home." When she delivered Sherwan to the extraction point, Rachel discovered that the medical team had set up a field hospital to treat the evacuated soldiers. All 10 previous casualties were alive and receiving treatment. Their conditions stabilized enough for helicopter evacuation once the tactical situation allowed. "One more," Rachel announced, preparing for the final trip. "Thompson, you can barely stand," Torres protested. "Let me go get the last one." Rachel shook her head. "I started this. I finished this." The final evacuation was the most dangerous. Jian was still conscious and fighting, but he was the last thing standing between the insurgents and total control of the Kurdish position. Rachel would have to reach him, convince him to abandon his position, and evacuate him while insurgent forces were literally overrunning the area. When Rachel reached the Kurdish position for the 12th time, she found Jian behind a pile of rocks, firing his last magazine at advancing insurgents. He looked at her with surprise and desperate determination. "American soldier, you must go," he said in English. "Position is lost." "Not without you," Rachel replied, grabbing him by the tactical vest. "Everyone else is safe. Now it's your turn." The evacuation of Jian was a running fight through the ravine. Insurgent forces had discovered their escape route and were firing down into the narrow passage. Rachel and Jian moved as fast as possible while bullets ricocheted off the stone walls around them. Halfway through the ravine, Jian was hit by a bullet that struck his shoulder. Rachel caught him as he fell, realizing that she would have to carry him the rest of the way while under direct enemy fire. "Leave me," Jian whispered. "Save yourself." "Nobody gets left behind," Rachel replied, lifting him into a fireman's carry. "That's not how this works." The final climb out of the ravine was a nightmare of pain, exhaustion, and determination. Rachel's body had nothing left to give, but her will refused to accept failure. She climbed hand over hand while carrying Jian, using techniques she'd learned months ago during SOC training, but applying them in circumstances no training could have simulated. When she finally reached the extraction point with Jian, Rachel collapsed completely. All 12 Kurdish soldiers were safe, alive, and receiving medical treatment. She had done the impossible, not because she was the strongest soldier, but because she refused to give up when lives depended on her. 6 months later, Rachel stood in the Pentagon's Hall of Heroes for the second time in her military career. This time, however, she wasn't just receiving recognition. She was being inducted into an elite group of soldiers whose actions had fundamentally changed military doctrine. The ceremony was attended by Kurdish officials, including Commander Halil, who had flown to Washington specifically to witness Rachel's recognition. All 12 soldiers she had rescued had survived their wounds and returned to duty, a testament to both her courage and her medical skills. Staff Sergeant Rachel Thompson, the general conducting the ceremony, announced, displayed extraordinary heroism and selfless devotion to duty. Her actions resulted in the successful evacuation of 12 Allied soldiers from an active combat zone under conditions that military experts initially deemed impossible. In the months following the rescue, Rachel's story had spread throughout the military community and beyond. But more importantly, it had sparked a fundamental reevaluation of how the military assessed physical capability and combat readiness. Captain Davis, who had been promoted to major following the Syrian deployment, approached Rachel after the ceremony. "Thompson, I want you to know that your actions have changed how we train soldiers. We're developing new protocols that focus on adaptive problem-solving and unconventional approaches to combat challenges." The Kurdish rescue had demonstrated that military effectiveness couldn't be measured purely by traditional physical standards. Rachel's success had come from her ability to think creatively, adapt to extreme circumstances, and refuse to accept conventional limitations. Dr. Hassan, the Kurdish physician who had treated the elderly patient during Rachel's first humanitarian mission, had also flown to Washington for the ceremony. She approached Rachel with a warm smile and an unexpected proposal. "Staff Sergeant Thompson, I wanted to thank you personally for saving my colleague Commander Halil. But I also wanted to extend an invitation. We're establishing a new medical training program for combat medics, combining American tactical medicine with Kurdish knowledge of mountain rescue techniques. Would you consider serving as chief instructor?" The offer represented an opportunity to institutionalize the lessons Rachel had learned, that courage and innovation could overcome physical limitations, and that the most effective soldiers were often those who found unconventional solutions to impossible problems. Over the following year, Rachel divided her time between the new training program and speaking engagements, where she shared her story with military audiences around the world. Her message was always the same. Excellence in military service came not from conforming to traditional expectations, but from maximizing individual strengths while refusing to accept artificial limitations. At one such speaking engagement, Rachel addressed a group of female cadets at West Point. A young woman in the audience raised her hand during the question period. "Ma'am, I'm interested in infantry service, but my instructors keep suggesting I consider other career fields. They say I'm not built for combat operations. How did you overcome that kind of resistance?" Rachel smiled, remembering her own journey from doubt to validation. "The question isn't whether you're built for combat operations. The question is whether you're willing to build yourself into the soldier your mission requires. Physical capability matters, but it's not the only thing that matters. Sometimes the most important strength is the strength to keep going when everyone else thinks you should quit." The cadet nodded, her expression showing the same determination Rachel remembered feeling years earlier at Fort Braxton. After the speaking engagement, Rachel visited the military medical center where several of the Kurdish soldiers she had rescued were receiving advanced treatment for their injuries. Baran, the first soldier she had evacuated, was learning to walk again with the help of a prosthetic leg. When he saw Rachel, his face lit up with joy. "American sister," he called out in much improved English. "You saved my life, and now I learn to be strong again." "You were always strong," Rachel replied. "I just helped you get to safety so you could heal." Baran's recovery was symbolic of something larger, the idea that strength came in many forms, and that the most important victories were often achieved not through overwhelming force, but through persistence, creativity, and the refusal to leave anyone behind. As her military career continued, Rachel found herself in increasingly important positions where her unique combination of tactical expertise and inspirational leadership made her invaluable. She was promoted to Sergeant First Class, then Staff Sergeant, and eventually Master Sergeant, with each promotion acknowledging not just her individual achievements, but her ability to develop other soldiers. The training program she helped establish became a model for military education worldwide, emphasizing adaptive thinking and unconventional problem-solving alongside traditional combat skills. Soldiers who completed the program were known for their ability to succeed in impossible circumstances, carrying forward the lessons Rachel had learned in that Syrian ravine. 10 years after the Kurdish rescue, Rachel received a letter that brought tears to her eyes. It was from Cihan, the last soldier she had evacuated, who was now a colonel in the Kurdish military. He wrote about establishing a memorial at the site of their rescue, honoring not just the 12 soldiers who had been saved, but the principle that no one gets left behind when courage and determination are applied to seemingly impossible challenges. Dear American sister, the letter concluded, you taught us that strength is not about how much you can carry, but about how far you will go to carry others to safety. This lesson guides everything we do now. Rachel folded the letter carefully and placed it in her desk drawer next to her military decorations. Then she walked outside to where her current class of combat medics was struggling through an obstacle course, learning the same lessons she had learned years ago, that the measure of a soldier wasn't their size or their strength, but their willingness to carry others when they couldn't carry themselves. Johnson, she called to a smaller student who was falling behind, remember what I taught you about mechanical advantage. It's not about being stronger than the obstacle. It's about being smarter than the obstacle. Johnson nodded and applied the technique Rachel had demonstrated, successfully completing the carry that had been giving him trouble. As Rachel watched her students learn and grow, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. From that first day when Captain Davis questioned her combat readiness to the moment she carried 12 wounded soldiers to safety, she had proven that courage came in all sizes and that heroes were made not by their physical capabilities, but by their refusal to give up when others were counting on them. And in training facilities around the world, a new generation of soldiers was learning that same lesson, that the most important strength was the strength to keep going, to find solutions when none seemed possible, and to carry others to safety no matter how impossible the circumstances might seem. Rachel Thompson had proved beyond any doubt that she was strong enough to carry anyone, anywhere when it mattered most. But more importantly, she had taught others that they were strong enough too. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.